There we go. Now we're recording. All right. Hi, folks. This is the third in our series of seminars from Dr. Alex Kirkpatrick on communicating around AI in science. And hopefully most of you were able to view the first recording or participate in that first conversation. And at the end of today, Alex will talk about what your preferences are for the second seminar in the series, which had a lot of technical difficulties, so we need to redo in some way. So we'll definitely discuss that towards the end to make sure that everybody is able to access that content in some way. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for turning out. Yeah, and this is, well, it was going to be my final seminar, but I've actually missed one. So I'll take a straw poll at the end as to how you want me to deliver that one asynchronously through video or another synchronous seminar like this. But this one is a very brief touch upon what are essentially some very fundamental concepts in science communication that can potentially help guide your public-facing communications. If you don't already know, I'm Alex Kirkpatrick, a science communicator and communication scientist here at the Centre for Sustaining Agriculture and Natural Resources. If you want to ask any questions throughout, then just go ahead and put them in the chat as they come up, and I'll try and respond to them as they happen. This isn't a particularly formal presentation. If I miss them, Jordan can just pipe up and interrupt and let me know. My goal here is to point your mind towards some important concepts that are often overlooked in public science communication, like using theory to define goals and create messages. So I can offer hints and tips about the type of things you want to be thinking about, but what I can't do here, or even through prolonged face-to-face instruction perhaps, is tell you how to communicate, nor would I want to, because there's no magic bullet to persuasion or achieving what you want to achieve from public communication. We all have different styles and preferences, and we all engage audiences with their own unique community norms and individual preferences. So I'm assuming that in many respects, you're already a very competent communicator, perhaps better than me in a lot of contexts, right? Communication's very subjective. But I do think we can all learn to better construct strategic, tactical messages and engagement campaigns and set and measure profitable goals by paying attention to the rich body of social scientific research that explores public engagement with science and technology. I'm going to focus mainly on the AI aspect and the diffusion of ICT, really, in this one, just to keep it nice and streamlined. So you can see my question on the screen there. I'm interested on what you feel is the most important goal of strategic science communication or public engagement activities, in your opinion. So drop your answers in the chat. I know there are a lot of goals potentially, but which goal guides your approach, and which do you measure when measuring your impact, if any, or, you know, which do you believe should be the fundamental goal? Well, I thought someone was very quick to reply, and it's just an AI assistant. It happens a lot now. What is your goal of strategic science communication? Understand the science sufficiently and apply it to their work decisions. Yeah, understanding is a common goal we reach for. Information, informing the lay person. That could obviously mean many things, informing them. I'm assuming you mean, again, transferring understanding. Again, Jordan, provide understandable information without scaring people. appropriate transparency. I like that, right? Particularly in relation to AI. Trust in AI is kind of low, and transparency is one way to ameliorate that, unblackboxing AI. And that goes for the rest of the science as well, right? People don't like the uncertainty around certain things, and they crave kind of transparency from the scientific community. So that's a really good goal to set. And yeah, Georgine, again, understanding science information, clear messages that will last in people's minds. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so these are very common sorts of goals, right? Understanding seems to be the primary one that people reach for, and that's true across the board, right? Communicating novel science and technology is unlike communicating many other things due to the conceptual complexity of many sciences, the unfamiliarity of our lexis, and the relative social distance to us perceived by non-scientists. Of course, we know we're just normal people like them, but that's not how we're seen necessarily. So it's crucial that we communicate science scientifically. And what I mean by that is we construct communication strategy and applied communications from empirical evidence. But many scientific institutions have historically treated communication very unscientifically and instead made broad assumptions about non-scientists and how they process science. Perhaps the most sort of pernicious example is characterized as the knowledge deficit hypothesis of science communication, or simply the deficit model. And it's a good place for us to start, because if we think about it, when we set understanding or the transference of knowledge as a goal, you can measure it, right? And we find it important. How much knowledge do you have? It's kind of objective, right? But actually, objective literacy and knowledge buys you very little in terms of attitude and behavior. So while you might spread knowledge, you don't activate anything else necessarily. And this is a well-trodden path, but the first assumption of the deficit model is that there exists a general public, and that's not really true, right? We are a collection of different publics. But anyway, the assumption is that this general public, this monolithic public, are underinformed about science and technology, which isn't necessarily true. In fact, national surveys find that people are generally pretty well informed about science to the extent that they need to be. For example, most people know that the Earth orbits the sun, outer space is a vacuum, or that things on the quantum scale are smaller than things on the atomic scale. And in general, surveys find that people are pretty positive about scientists overall, affording us a great deal of deference and trust. And another assumption we tend to make is that quantitative knowledge or understanding of science is associated with attitude and feeling towards science, i.e., transfer knowledge and understanding and you win back something positive. Not found to be true empirically. The more science you understand, the more you love, trust, and support science is the assumption, but research finds this to be faulty, and studies rarely find any statistical correlation between objective science understanding and attitude. Just because someone understands the greenhouse effect doesn't mean they are pro-environment or anti-fossil fuel. Knowing what machine learning is doesn't mean you trust AI. And just because you want an autonomous vehicle doesn't mean you know how LiDAR works or what LiDAR stands for, right? Knowledge, attitude, and behavior is kind of a faulty connection. And this one might be controversial to some of us, but the fact is there are many forms of understanding and knowledge, from contextual to spiritual to the purely subjective feeling of being knowledgeable, which actually does impact attitude and behavior rather than any objective understanding, i.e. the self-efficacy of feeling like you know something will influence something, whether you do or not. And science is a relatively new way of understanding things. Humans don't need it to make sense of their environment, or at least they didn't before formal science sort of came along in the 1600s. Besides, look at all the misinformation and shoddy peer-reviewed results that science churns out. I don't think it's safe to assume that scientific knowledge is automatically the emperor of all understanding. And all these assumptions lead to what we call the deficit hypothesis. If we fill the deficit in public understanding of science, then public attitudes towards and acceptance of science will improve as a result. This hypothesis is not supported by the literature overall. Knowledge is very important, right? Awareness is crucial, but awareness kind of just happens through mere exposure to new innovations or seeing news stories about it. You gain little by setting it as the main goal of a campaign. Anyone who's ever taught kids or people in higher education probably understands that knowledge kind of happens in its own time, subjectively, as a function of student engagement and motivation. You can't force someone to learn what you think they need to know, and even if you could, even if they knew what you thought they needed to know, it doesn't necessarily correlate with any attitude or behavior. If they know what you know, it doesn't mean they feel what you feel or vote the same way or anything like that. So it's a nice place to always start with the fact that science finds that this knowledge deficit hypothesis and pursuing knowledge as a goal really doesn't get you much. And here's just that translated into AI communication. It's the same deal, right? So what we really need to aim for then is still knowledge and engagement and learning, but it's knowledge through self-exploration on a deeper level. It's to prime elaboration, prime engagement, prime this kind of self-exploration that essentially social learning is. And to do that, we need to put objective, measurable knowledge transference aside and start to really analyze what makes science audiences really tick, right? And again, that's not to diminish knowledge. It's important, but it kind of does just happen. So let's assume that one foundational goal of computer science like AI is adoption and diffusion, right? Seems to be central to a lot of goals. Well, this is an inherently communicative process, perhaps best articulated on a societal scale by Diffusions of Innovation Theory by Everett Rogers. The best iteration published in 2003, but his research goes back to the 60s. An innovation can be a thought, a practice, a product, or a theory. And with that in mind, a lot of the diffusion of innovations takes place in agriculture and following the spread of different agricultural practices through social systems. And over decades of diffusions of innovations research, it was found that we could categorize people in a social system into discrete groups. And across contexts and social systems, the diffusion process was found to follow what is now a very famous S-shaped curve as words, thoughts, adoption spread from one group to the other. So in theory, if you could establish what percentage of a system was using an innovation, you would know which group to target next. And I'll show you how. So only about 2.5% of people are innovators. I consider everyone here is probably an innovator. I mean, you're literally paid to innovate, right? Innovators are eager to try new ideas and technologies, often at a higher risk of failure. They are well connected, financially resourced, and have higher risk tolerance. They pay attention to media more because they have nobody else to learn from, because they're usually the first in their social groups to find out about new ideas and experiment with new technologies. These are the techies who are likely to adopt and experiment with new technologies regardless of their potential to become widespread. So about 1% of Americans drive electric vehicles at the minute, pure EVs. About 2% own any cryptocurrency. So we're still at the innovation stage of these technologies. We can engage more innovators, potentially, studies find, by showcasing the cutting edge research and developments, which we like doing, right? They are likely among the few of us actually interested in the technical details and specifics of AI advancements, for example. A great way to spread positive thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors to these folks could be by offering access to beta tests in particular. It's a great way of marketing to the innovators, or pilot programs, hands-on field days, right? Scientists are quite good at engaging this little minority as it stands, because very often we are innovators too. We talk their language, we often share their worldviews, their education levels, and we get excited by the same things. But we and they are only 2.5% around of any social system. So what if we want to start engaging the next adoption group to get this process of widespread diffusion really catalyzed? Well, the early adopters would be your next group. And this group has a high degree of opinion leadership. Early adopters are more integrated into the local community than the innovators, and are more discerning in their adoption choices, i.e. they likely have more social clout than the innovators, who are more niche techie types. For these early adopters, we could focus on showing how innovations can be leveraged for competitive advantage and leadership within their fields of business, or simply their social circles, right? These kinds of people are particularly susceptible to testimonials and case studies from whoever the influential innovators are to them. Early adopters look for both functionality, but importantly, proof of concept before adopting a new technology. They're less willing to experiment than the innovators. Remember those crypto ads during the Super Bowl starting a couple of years ago? It was a clear attempt to sell the concept beyond the innovators to the early adopters, but crypto still hovers around 2%. So it's not quite proven enough for the early adopters, despite influencers trying their best to spread the concept further. And think about ChatGPT as well. It's a great example of diffusion from innovators to early adopters. The innovators were the beta testers, perhaps sharing information on specific networks like Discord, etc. And then the early adopters will have followed, the student athlete who noticed how it could help them get higher grades, the teachers who noticed how people were getting higher grades and learned to use GPT themselves, the journalists who watched the R&D and beta testing and realized how this could work for them and their industry. And next we cross what we call the chasm, right? This marks the transition from the socially influential, performance-seeking early adopters to the more pragmatic and skeptical early majority. We call this the chasm to signify the difficulty of marketing a new idea to the early majority relative to the early adopters and innovators. So lots of innovations like mini discs, Betamax, Google Glasses, the Segway, they find some traction among techie and venturesome innovators and advantage-seeking early adopters willing to take a punt. But then many innovations stall. About 15 to 20% of people globally, for example, are vegetarian, right? But vegetarianism as an idea, selling that to the early majority and onwards is nearly impossible. Many thoughts, ideas, innovations, technologies stall at this point more than diffuse. So more cautious and deliberate in their adoption of new ideas, the early majority needs to see hard evidence that the innovation works reliably before they're willing to adopt. As time goes on, the yet to adopt groups are naturally more cautious, risk averse, and less inclined to waste time and resources on things that potentially might not work for them, or even might entail too much cognitive effort or learning. If you do manage to cross the chasm, it's largely social influence and social leaning communication that carries it over. So these people demand a different style. Unlike the innovators, you can't go in with the techno-scientific knowledge and expect them to feel some reward from that or attitude change. To appeal to the kind of early majority, you need to focus more on practical demonstrations and evidence of effectiveness. And that goes for any innovation. We wouldn't want to get too fixated on the technical aspects or jargon here. We can communicate to these audiences by emphasizing the practical benefits of adopting a technology, including productivity enhancements, ease of use is an important one. Selling them on success stories and practical results from early adopters can be particularly persuasive, i.e. storytelling, contextualization, influencers, and real-world testimonials. So it's less what is this, say an AI or something, what is this innovation and how does it work? Not so worried about that, more does it work well already for others and what can it do for me, right? So as we go along in time, the less important any kind of techno-scientific understanding becomes to the diffusion process. And next come the late majority, the skeptics. The late majority adopts a new technology mainly because of economic necessity or building peer pressure. They are typically less financially secure than early adopters, less able to wager on potentially faulty ideas or technologies. So the idea has to be cost effective. I imagine my grandparents finally getting the internet in the late 2000s. They weren't jazzed about it, but they'd fatalistically realized that they needed it to email friends and families who lived far away and were now online. Or they just needed to manage their health through online portals, or their physical health was diminishing and ordering online was a necessity, right? By this point, an innovation is so diffused that it begins to define a social system, and even people who don't like the idea can't avoid it anymore. Your influence is waning at this point. Smartphones are another great example, right? 97% of us have smartphones in America. Or democracy. The USA has spoken, right? And it's smartphones and public elections for everybody, whether you like it or not. This is the moment we call critical mass, whereby an innovation sort of sells itself through close-knit social networks, friends, family, or the sheer social pressure necessitating adoption. And here's where the influence of mass media and science itself kind of starts to wane. But if you need to talk to this group, if more widespread adoption is your goal, there are clues. You can address doubts specifically. Transparency again, right? Focusing on simplicity, support, monetary value. Sell them social influence and socially proximal messaging. Use social networks and viral marketing. Make an idea seem ubiquitous and add to that social pressure. Sell an innovation as a social norm. It's particularly appealing to these people. To adopt is to belong. And this is where your ability to contextualize an innovation or address controversy and ideological concerns really comes into play, right? Transparency is very important as we go along. Offer assurances, warranties, and support to overcome skepticism. When it comes to AI, apparently a third of your social system, say farmers in the PNW, fit into this category. And it's difficult to convert these people to the idea of AI, let alone to get them to take a chance on it, right? And this is where audience targeting comes in, because the diffusion process really shows you that you can waste a lot of time talking to a lot of people, when really, if you're strategic and targeted in your messaging, if you could get to the innovators and the early adopters, you can essentially have them and their behavior push it across the chasm. So, finally, there are the laggards, right? The laggards are your gramps screaming obscenities at the commercials on the television, right? Highly skeptical of change, highly traditional, highly suspect of persuasion. They adopt an innovation only when it reaches critical mass and they have no choice, or they just never adopt. If you want a job nowadays, you pretty much need a smartphone. So if you want employment, you need a phone. About 75% of Americans use some form of social media. So that's another example. So while some, perhaps most of the late majority have adopted, there isn't that leap to the laggards, and probably won't be until a generation of humans have departed this mortal coil, right? But everyone can be reached potentially. If there is a value to getting that last 16% on board, which if you belong to a commercial company, there likely will be, because 16% of a population is millions of dollars, if not more. you have to appreciate at this stage that we're talking to people on a very individualistic basis. There are a lot of things that could force someone not to adopt a well-diffused technology. They could be in prison, they're differently abled, they have a strong philosophical or ideological aversion to your idea. They don't have the facilitating conditions like a stable home, time, or money to enable adoption. You need to appreciate that. And overall, so what I'm trying to say, this is just one example, right? You can inform your strategy by first establishing from theory and empirical data that finds this S curve to just spring up across societies and across innovations around the world. You can take note of it and essentially measure how many people in your social system that you're targeting have already adopted, and that will give you an idea on who you're talking to right now. If only sort of 1% have adopted a certain technology among a social group, then you know you're still thick there with the innovators. And you still, which is good for us because we like selling science and we like talking jargon and technicalities, and the innovators are like us, they are us. And so they like hearing that. So that's fairly easy. But then if you really want to catalyze the process, you'll instead target the next one down the line, the early adopters in this case, in that example. But diffusion of innovations can help us to categorize and understand our audiences and decide who to target and what their general kind of bent is towards communication. But that's on a macroscopic societal scale. Good for mass communication or asynchronous communication, but it doesn't really help us know what is important to the individual stood in front of us or their variable psychology. But the unified theory of acceptance and use of technology is an example of an empirical model that's well tested, that accounts for generations of IT adoption research, IT particularly, IT like AI, and shows us the main important psychometric variables that you might want to prime and target in order to achieve acceptance. It also makes measuring impact fairly straightforward, as all the associated scales are, again, tried, tested psychometric measures. So the dependent variable is usage behavior, which is naturally informed by intent. Now, there is a difference between intent and behavior, right? 1,000,001 things might prevent someone from using an innovation, even if they intended to do so. But intending to do so is always the first step. Now, 4 key variables influence adoption intention. They are all subjective and perceptual. Therefore, you can influence them. You can influence their strength, perhaps even their direction through messaging. First is performance expectancy, which is the degree to which an individual believes that using the technology will help them achieve gains in personal performance or other things that are important to them, like not going to work or having a shorter commute. For example, ChatGPT might enhance my research productivity, making me a better scholar with enhanced output. But I need to envision that reality before intending to make it real. And you can help people do that, right? You can sell them on that mediated reality. Note the subtle difference between expecting the innovation to work well and expecting yourself to be enhanced through using the innovation. I expect a Bugatti Veyron to perform well and break 200 miles per hour on a racetrack. I don't expect it will make me any better at my job or help me get a promotion. So, big difference there. Performance expectancy is all about your own performance. How does it perform for you and what does it make you? The other one is effort expectancy. So you can target this as well. It's the ease of use associated with the technology. All people value relief from cognitive load, i.e. mental stress, even us, right? If people perceive a high barrier to entry, too much learning, too much intricacy, and a dense user manual, lots of scientific language and techno-scientific details, they're less likely to adopt an innovation. This is why scientific jargon and knowledge understanding has little value to adoption behavior. It's dense, technical, requires a lot of work to decode and understand if you don't already speak it fluently. And to be fair, it's quite difficult for us to also translate. So effort and stress is a barrier. If you can lessen perceived effort, make things seem easier to digest, then you can increase intention to use. This is where your ability to tell stories, to translate into common language, and relate to people on a really human level comes into play. People need to understand an innovation to a certain extent, i.e., I need to push this button so it goes, but they don't necessarily want to learn too many skills and specifics unless they're innovators like us. Most people, research finds, are pretty turned off by the thought of having to learn a lot of new skills. So that's something to bear in mind. But again, it's perception, and you can essentially manipulate the effort expectancy. Then there's perhaps the most important variable to the majority of people, one that can overcome many other barriers to adoption, and that's social influence, or the degree to which an individual perceives that important others want them to use an innovation. Important others are people like family, friends, colleagues, a celebrity that they have a parasocial relationship with. Nowadays, this is perhaps enhanced given digital influencers and the omnipresence of social marketing and advertising. Marketers often try to frame an innovation, a product, as socially desirable and accepted by people just like you, or at least people you want to be like. And there's a third person effect here with social influence, whereby we all wrongly believe that others are more susceptible to it than ourselves, but this isn't true in the slightest. We all succumb to subtle social pressures and the behaviors of the people we most value. So, this is where building those bridges, these communication bridges, and being able to empathize with an audience, being able to sell yourself as a social entity and a socially desirable entity, not just a weird socially distant scientist, but a member of the community, someone who cares. This really helps. Or if you can get someone else more influential to do that for you, brilliant. Target someone with more social influence and let them diffuse the idea. But this is the last major influence. Sometimes you feel your environment won't facilitate your adoption no matter what. Strictly speaking, facilitating conditions are the degree to which an individual believes that an organizational and technical infrastructure exists to support the use of the system. There's no point buying a cell phone, for example, if you don't think a carrier has the infrastructure to let you make a phone call from your house, right? No point adopting an orchard robot if you don't think there are technical experts on hand to help you fix it when it inevitably malfunctions. But again, this is perception, open to persuasion. We can, through messaging, suggest to people that the facilitating conditions exist. Of course, we have to make sure they do exist, but people might not be aware of the facilitating conditions, right? But we can help people believe. And finally, the strength of these variables has been found to be moderated by age, gender, experience, and voluntariness. Men, women, non-binary people do not interact with technology the same way, just as they don't perceive risk or any number of other variables in the same way. Messaging should account for this. Age is also a massive moderating factor, particularly for ICTs, right? I dare say that the youth of today are far more open to experimenting with AI than older folks. But it's the older folks that often hold the purse strings and decide what innovations are adopted on farms, in corporations, or even in government. Meanwhile, the same older folks have control primarily because they're already relatively successful without AI. There may exist less perceived performance enhancement from innovations, higher effort expectancy in learning new things and doing away with traditional well-trodden technologies that are really easy for them to do because they've been exposed to these processes over and over again. I'm sure you experience that with a lot of innovations. Perhaps you're trying to diffuse, particularly in agriculture, very traditionalistic sort of sector. If someone's doing something very well and has been successful at it, then it's less likely that they're going to see value in your new innovation. And then there's voluntariness of use. The orchard worker, for example, has no choice but to use an automated system if their boss decides to buy and incorporate it into their practice. So unfortunately, it doesn't always matter what they think according to this model. You have to use the system or you have to find another job, right? So again, it can help you know who to target and talk to. And importantly, experience with the system is a factor. And that could come under understanding, right? But it's an experiential understanding, an experiential subjective knowledge of the system. Performance expectancy and effort, etc., can be enhanced through exposure and hands-on experience. Try before you buy. Talking about artificial intelligence with someone with no conscious experience of using AI is different from talking to someone with lots of experience. So again, know your audience and establish experience level. When experience is lacking, try and create spaces for experience. And what leads from experience is understanding, their own subjective version anyway. And all of this gives some massive clues as to what your goals and objectives might be and how you might strategically construct messages to achieve them. Also, you can easily find out how to measure these variables with psychometric scales. There's no point setting out on a strategic communication campaign if you don't measure the impact and iterate your approach. Out of interest, before I move on, does anyone notice anything glaringly missing that they think from this model? This model is born from like 30 years of research, and these are the important variables. Is there anything missing that you thought would be there? I'll move on and you can drop that in the chat if you feel you notice anything there. So they're just two examples of how established theory can help you realize who your audience is and tactically communicate certain aspects over others, right? But regardless of who you're communicating with, who you're engaging, where you're engaging, trust, in my opinion, should be your primary concern. And, related to that, transparency. As we see, trust in scientists is characterized by perceived benevolence, transparency, competence, and our integrity. Just as knowledge is the undercurrent of AI science communication, so is trust. But unlike knowledge, trust doesn't kind of happen not without more intervention. Many scholars now believe that fostering trust in science and scientists is the single most important outcome variable to pursue. I don't disagree necessarily. Think about mRNA vaccines. Over 80% of Americans, all but the laggards really, got vaccinated against COVID-19. Yes, they saw the relative advantage of doing so. It was made easy to get. It was free and federally facilitated. There was almost insurmountable social pressure, but still few understood the science of mRNA vaccines or the intricacies of medical science overall. People got the vaccine in large part without knowledge, but with trust in science and scientists. People believe in anthropogenic climate change when they trust environmental science and scientists, even when they don't make any effort to understand the science of global warming. People do not trust AI for the most part, and that's important. Not at the minute they don't. Thus, they probably don't really trust the folks who develop it either, because the two are correlated, right? We invent the AI, we are the AI. And transparency and trust are big issues at the minute that potentially stymie diffusion of a lot of AI dependent technologies. So how can we foster trust? Well, this is the golden question. So here are some very basic hints and tips to get you there based on just this brief introduction I've given you today. I'll be honest though, if I could get everybody to trust me or trust science, then I'd be doing a lot better in my career. And as far as I can see, no one else really knows a magic bullet either, because there won't be one. So again, to reiterate, fostering trust is more important than technical knowledge overall, right? And the way we reach that current thinking is via dialogue, not deficit, i.e., not assuming that there is a deficit in understanding that there's any value to us filling, but rather engaging in dialogue or dialogical practices, like creating spaces whereby we can show active listening to people and communities, spaces for mutual engagement, citizen participation, reducing that perceived social distance between us and them. The science pub or Café Scientifique of good examples of this, right? Where members of the community are invited into these shared spaces to have dialogue and participate, right? Citizen science programs as well. Instead of us telling you about science, why don't you come and do science with us in this fun occasion? And learning kind of happens despite you, but in the meantime, you're engaged in dialogue with people. You're showcasing your trustworthiness, your benevolence, your transparency. Yeah, and personification is hugely important. Social influence is so important to all of this. And so showing the scientist and not just the science is really crucial, right? Personifying science by showing the people who do it and engaging in the human aspects of what we do. So yeah, as I've hinted at as well, you can target specific adopter groups and analyze their communication preferences. Diffusion of innovations is one way to do that. You can also use social media analytics nowadays, if you have an expert on hand who knows how to do that. And appreciating who these different adopter groups are and the fact that we know about them because they just keep occurring every time someone does a study on the diffusion of an innovation across different cultures and societies. Yeah, the shape, the speed of the S-curve kind of changes a little bit, but it's still an S-curve, and we still find the similar percentages of people fit into these categories. So use that information that's there for you. Showing an innovation in context and relying on storytelling and testimonials is great, right? They're very influential, but also by contextualizing an innovation, you're personifying yourself and it and showing you understand, showing you actively listen to the situation of the people you're communicating with or the communities. Storytelling is the default mode of human communication. Science jargon is not, right? So if you can learn to tell good stories, or if you have access to a storyteller that you can, create a space and put them in that space with other people, then very influential. If you can get testimonials from socially influential people within their community, if you can get them to tell a story, then bonus points. Avoiding jargon is important. Aim for simplicity and easy engagement. Again, that circles back to storytelling, right? Knowing what the default modes of communication are to certain groups and talking their language, not trying to lift them up, as it were, in that deficit style approach to talk our language. That doesn't work. And here's for transparency and trust, right? One great way of approaching that is I've found people don't expect scientists and people working in science to necessarily address the things they really care about, right? We in AI research rarely publicly address the risks or the fears. We kind of laugh off a lot of the, science fiction backed fears that they have, that people have learned from the mass media system. But in truth, that's what they care about. You can kind of shock people by addressing it and by getting into the weeds about those things, addressing risk, threat, and ideological issues. It makes you look trustworthy, transparent, willing to engage, right? And I personally love controversy, and I love conspiracy and fake science and misinformation, and I love addressing those people. You find you'll have some really great conversations, actually. And I see them as engagement opportunities, whereas a lot of the time we willfully ignore public concern. We either diminish them, or we're too scared to address them, or we don't think it's our place. But if we're creating the science that creates the controversy, then it's definitely our place, right? And also actively debunking AI myths. I keep reading this over and over again in the new literature. It's crucial to breaking down barriers. There are a lot of myths and misinformation about AI that we have the power to demystify that, to take it out of the black box and show them what we know, and in advancement of trustworthiness, tell them what we don't know, right? Audience analysis is key. Everything begins with audience analysis. And set your goals specific to the audience and the space in which you engage them, and measure your impact, report your findings, and iterate your strategy. Because at the minute we keep doing the same things that don't really work in science communication, like single-mindedly pursuing understanding and knowledge. And if more of us measured our impact, not just the knowledge gained, but whether this knowledge correlates with any behaviors or attitude, then we'd know more how to iterate. But instead, we don't really measure impact. We just circle back and begin the same process again, probably making the same mistakes. And this is important as well, particularly for AI, right? Because we are still in those earlier stages with a lot of innovations. You have some innovations. I'd argue that people don't really know that their email spam is filtered by artificial intelligence. And so that's not a conscious use. But conscious use of AI, like ChatGPT, yeah, that's burgeoning. But a lot of the things we deal with, particularly at AgAID, there really isn't a lot of diffusion going on there. And so at the minute, it's the mass media who really spit out that information that the early adopters and that focus on. So if you understand the mass media system, you potentially understand a lot of the perspectives of the people you'll be talking to. But all in all, remember, no magic bullet to strategic communication. There's no certain way of achieving or missing your goals. All there is the scientific method. And I would implore you to do communication scientifically, to read the literature, come up with your hypotheses and your research questions around that, perform the intervention, measure the impact, and then tell the rest of us what you found. So we either do the things you did well, or we avoid the pitfalls you fell into, right? It's essential, and it's one of the things lacking from science communication, and that's a scientific approach. And so as scientists and extension professionals, researchers, you're not just ambassadors of your field, but also bridge builders, right? You have the power to demystify complex techno science and make it accessible and relatable to publics. And I encourage you to apply these strategies we've discussed today to enhance your outreach, but be aware, what can I communicate to you solidly in the space of an hour? Not a great deal, right? You have to go look at the literature yourself. You have to set your own goals, just with the understanding that, you know, knowledge, objective knowledge is one goal, but if you're really fixated on understanding and knowledge, don't measure it objectively, measure it subjectively. The feeling of knowledge is less important what they actually know, and it's more important what they feel they know. And you're going to need to read literature on subjective knowledge to understand that. And that's a tricky business too, because a lot of the time as subjective knowledge goes up, so does belief in misinformation. People who are misinformed about AI or science in general feel they know a lot about AI and science, and that's kind of worrying. So consider these things as well, not just in your formal kind of presentations, but in every kind of place where you get to talk about your work, whether it's in a casual conversation, in a bar, social media posts, during interviews, just chatting with people. In your professional capacity, each interaction is a chance to improve public engagement with AI, right? Public engagement over public understanding. Above all, aim for transparency. Someone hinted at that at the start, and I agree wholeheartedly. Transparency, particularly in relation to AI, is a brilliant goal to keep in mind, to provide the real undercurrent to everything you do. Because these are the most important variables when it comes to public trust in science. And the reason why we value trust so much is because trust is the key indicator of public support for policy, right? Above all else, public support for funding of science, public support for scientists. Trust in science is the biggest indicator of behavior related to science and technology, not knowledge, trust. So exchange knowledge for trust, and you're already doing a lot better. And so this is some nice jumping off point on the screen there. If you want any further reading, obviously the field of science communication is massive, and there's so much I can't touch upon here, but I've hopefully at least primed and painted a picture for you on how communications research can form the bedrock of how you communicate professionally to achieve your aims. Know your audience, number one. Know how ideas spread through a social system. Know the communication preferences of the different groups, and know that you need to foster trust in everything you do. And then you can begin to design spaces for engagement, right? And I'd encourage you as well to be as creative as possible. I love the blending of art and science. That's a really profitable way of reaching people. And so, is there anything else you'd like to discuss further with me? Any questions? If you just want to speak up or put it in the chat, I'll happily answer them. I can also put that last screen on again, because for any of you who've not marked down any of the literature you might want to read. Oops. Okay, I've stunned you. It's my goal.
I mean, Alex, maybe this is too much to unpack in 3 minutes, but I guess, when I think about, and maybe it's like you ask this question, like, what's the goal of communicating? And we're like trying to think of like, how do you capture that in the chat? But I guess, I often think of, the job is not like diffusion of new technologies, kind of the, in the sense of, we don't want people in agriculture to be adopting technologies that might create a financial burden or not be usable, or there's not clear value for them. So I guess, I both, very much feel like being reminded of those insights of how those different parts of diffusion matter a lot, and we should be thinking about where are we on that curve. And I also think there's a difference between, none of us work for a company that's trying to sell something, right? And really, I think, when I think about what we're trying to do, it is around kind of both interacting with people to help the science ask better questions that can help people understand how these technologies, in what context might they provide value, and in what context might they absolutely not provide value and they're not a good idea. So I guess maybe that's an overly complex goal, but I just, I don't know. Those are some of the thoughts in my mind. So since nobody else is talking, I'll just.
Well, yeah, and I'll reiterate that an innovation isn't just a technology. That's an innovative thought you've just had. If you want to persuade that thought among other people like us, it still follows the S-curve. It still follows the diffusion sort of process. There still has to be value to adoption of your opinion, of your thought, your practice, right? So I couch it in terms of technology here because this is an AgAID seminar and we're talking about AI for the most part. And diffusing an ICT is very often a central core part of AI research, right? There's no point creating beneficial AI if you can't diffuse it. But the same goes for any thought through a social system.
Yes. Oh, that is absolutely right. And I think it also, though, comes to this, like, the goal of large projects like AgAID is to create beneficial technology, but what that means, it's sort of like we can't fully know if that technology is beneficial without collaboration with, non-research partners.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where engagement comes in, right? Creating those spaces to have dialogue and learn from different publics, as well as to kind of downstream our information, right? And spread awareness and knowledge.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Anyway.
So before folks have to go, Alex, do you want to ask about the 3rd/2nd seminar?
Oh yeah, the seminar I missed a couple of weeks ago because we had a technological problem. It was just a research seminar on my own research, and I don't know whether it's best you'd like to receive that information synchronously through another one of these seminars, or whether because it is a research presentation, just we could pre-record that and upload that. I was wondering what people's preferences were. I haven't set up a poll or anything, but if there's a way of getting at that, do we prefer this kind of format, or would a video suffice? And again, it's a research presentation about my own research into science communication. So any thoughts?
I kind of like the live presentation, but it can go either way.
Yeah, I don't mind doing it live if that's helpful for people, or it just gives a opportunity to ask questions, of course, which is important.
Will you send out the recording from this one? I didn't have it in my calendar, so that's why I came in late.
Yes, I will. I'd hope to send them all as a bundle with all 3 of them, but I'll definitely send this one out, and I know how to reach you, Kristen. But we'll also do kind of here's a 3 seminar course package you can do down the road.
Okay.
We'll provide both. But
All right, thank you.
if anyone has other thoughts on how to do that 3rd one, let us know. But otherwise, Alex, I think we ought to consider doing it live, but we would need to make it happen before everybody's academic year ends in the next month or 2. So we can touch base on how to reschedule that.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Alex.
No worries.